individual, but why don't we go ahead and get started?
Sure, and do we have to do anything with the mic? It's all good?
Yeah.
And I don't have any slides prepared, and I don't know if you do. I thought this was pretty informal. We just talk about the process, perhaps comparing it to other similar processes with other granting agencies, and talk about my personal experience. I'm sure Dan will do the same for him. For me, I'm a little bit older than you are. So I've had grant opportunities at a variety of different private foundations, NIH, National Mess Society, and others over time. And PCORI grants are clearly different in many respects. One, the obvious one is that they are patient-centered, and you ask the questions not only from the point of view that you think that they have, but also you engage the patients, caregivers, other interested parties. And in our case, we're going to have stakeholder advisory committee meetings with pharma, state legislators, medical insurers, and others. But at the same time is not necessarily inclusive of everything. And a lot of the times, like every other granting process, you will probably know more about your area of what's going on than they do. And so they may not be able to ask you the questions the right way because they may not know the right way to ask the question. Person at PCORI with whom you can actually have a physical conversation on the phone, unlike NIH and a lot of other granting agencies where it's oftentimes difficult to get a hold of them on the phone. And I've had numerous discussions with people at PCORI, both electronically and over the phone, where we've revised things and changed things around. I would also say another remarkably refreshing and notable difference is that although the grant was originally a maximum of 3 years at $2 million, we sent the grant in and they sent the grant back saying, well, we really like the idea. We'd like to give you $4 million and have you make it longer with more patients. And that has never happened with any other grant in my life. And then, of course, we sent in a budget for more than $4 million. And we're still discussing, we're going back and forth. On Friday, we sent in our redos of the redos of the redos. So it's this long process that takes place. And in some respects, that's nice because everybody sort of agrees, you work things out, you find out some things that you've sort of written probably not correctly on the grant, and they're willing to not only point out when you've done some things that are sort of inconsistent, but also just work with you and not penalize you for it. I mean, they've been very, very reasonable to deal with as people administering these grants. So I've been very impressed that as a process, it's been much more favorable, but in some respects, a little bit more drawn out. And Dr. Kluger, who I think is supposed to join us, who's also in our department, who got his grant actually before mine, it was a very long process. And I think he's actually even potentially still working on it. An extremely long process to sort of get to the end before you can start. And so that's been a little bit more challenging, but I think it's for a good reason, not a bad reason. I think they're trying to just make sure that they spend the money properly, and they're wanting to make sure that they're not overspending. They really don't want to pay for things that are part of medical care. They want to pay only for those things that are truly experimental. And so unlike, say, a National Mess Society grant that would routinely pay for, or the NIH grants that might routinely pay for MRI scans, which is a big deal in our world, they really didn't want to pay for any MRI scans. And in fact, ours is a pragmatic trial where they're going to pay for one MRI scan because it's a safety scan, which is not part of standard of care. but we are performing the vast majority of our clinical work in this study, which is standard of care, and insurance companies are going to pay for that. And so they, I think, are much more interested in pragmatic trials like that, as opposed to what we think of as a large clinical trial that would probably cost, honestly, 3 to 4 times as much if we did it the way the pharmaceutical companies do it, or even if you do it by the way NIH does it. Would probably be 3 to 4 times the cost. So they're very cognizant of the cost issues, and they really don't want to pay for anything that is remotely standard medical care. And that's fine. We actually wrote it that way anyway, and it's fine. But they sometimes see things a little bit differently. But they were very accommodating, and I thought very reasonable when push came to shove. So those are my general comments. And sorry, I hope I didn't hog everything that you might have said.
No, I think I have different things to talk about.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so I'm Dan Matlock. I have been involved with 2 PCORI grants, one where I was the PI, the one that Allie introduced, on developing decision tools, website and videos for patients considering getting an implanted defibrillator. And I've also worked closely with Larry Allen on his project developing and testing a decision tool for a left ventricular assist device, or partial artificial heart. And I'll talk about how we engage patients in both of those trials a little bit. So for the ICD trial, this was the PCORI pilot, and it was brand new, and this whole idea you have to have patients involved was brand new, and people were trying to figure out what that meant. So we had done a survey with Kaiser, and you had like 6 weeks to write this grant. So we scrambled this panel together and presented our idea to them, and we said in the grant, we had patients' input in this grant idea. And in truth, they did. Some of the things they said did change some of the things we did. So it was authentic. It just still felt a little bit like we didn't actually engage them. So from that group, we developed an advisory panel with some patients from Kaiser and some patients from Colorado and some patients from Denver Health from some of the qualitative studies we'd been doing prior to the grant. And we had this wonderful advisory panel of authentic patients. And I'll tell you a story with the PCORI pilots. We were all invited / required to go to a meeting, a PCORI meeting, and we had to bring a patient with us. So I brought one of the patients from the panel. And he was bored stiff at this PCORI meeting. And so I would say PCORI did an awful job engaging patients in their meeting in the same way that I was doing an awful job engaging patients in the research. Because it's really difficult to do. But one of the things that was interesting about that PCORI meeting that kind of formed some of our next thinking on engaging patients is there was a huge stark difference between patients who were authentic and patients who were advocates. And they are not the same thing. And authentic patients, people with the experiences, were much less empowered. They were quieter. They kind of sat by themselves. They're the ones that I imagine all said, wow, this was boring. Whereas the advocates were always pushing to be on stage, were dressed in suits and ties. These people didn't even really look like patients anymore in the way that we see them in clinic. And if you think about conflicts of interest, in many ways, the advocacy groups have more of a conflict of interest than just about anybody at the meeting. And so we thought about that a lot because on the flip side, they were more empowered. They were more engaged in the research. I go to my panel, and even though I set it up saying we want you involved in the research, we want you involved in the idea, we had one meeting and I went and I said, I've got 3 questions I need help working through. And then I asked at the end of the meeting, how did this go? And the feedback I got was, well, we like it better when you just sort of present to us. So somewhere I was not engaging them correctly. Even though the words were there, I wasn't doing something right. So that's the ICD group. With the LVAD group, we have a lot fewer patients to really make a large advisory panel. So we have a couple patients locally, a couple patients nationally, and a caregiver locally of someone who declined an LVAD. And we meet with them periodically, and at the last meeting, they sort of said, why don't we just meet on an ad hoc basis? Because now that the trial's going, we're just recruiting patients. There's actually not a lot changing. But as we get into some of our implementation evaluation, we're going to bring them in, present it to them, and get their feedback on that. But it's also been hard to engage them there as well. So then the third thing we've done, Carmen Lewis, one of my colleagues who co-directs the Shared Decision-Making Core with me, she and I developed this patient and family advisory panel. And we did a lot of thinking about this panel where we wanted people who were authentic, but we wanted to take a step towards that sort of empowered advocate without getting to the point where they were just fully pushing an agenda. And we talked to the head of the Patient Family-Centered Care Council at the hospital, and he said he interviews everybody that comes into the Patient Family-Centered Care Council, and his biggest criteria is, do they understand the concept of a shared agenda? And because he says some people come in and they just want to fix parking, or they just want to take down one thing. And that's not really understanding that there's pressures from lots of people. So we designed this interview, and he helped us to really get at, do they understand that, oh yeah, patients are under pressure, investigators are under pressure, these pressures might be different. And so we interviewed about 20 people, and we selected about 10 to come to this patient and family advisory panel. And now and this is not related to a project. This is something we're funding with a small grant from the dean. It's not taking a lot of time now that it's together, and we meet with him every other month. And it's open to the whole university. If you have a panel you'd like just an idea with a sort of generic panel, we specifically look for patients who are older and had experience with major medical illnesses. And that's because that's sort of our interest, but that still sort of broadly applies to lots of research. The panel's also going through some very, very introductory research training, such as how does a grant idea come to be, and what is the different kinds of funding sources, and what is a specific aim, what is a hypothesis, just very basic terms so we all sort of speak the same lexicon. And so then we can communicate in this way, and they can communicate with other investigators who come in with ideas. They can understand, oh, this person's early on trying to get this together for a grant. I have an idea what that looks like. That's our hope anyway. It's a great panel so far. It's a little different because it's not like the ICD panel where they're all patients who'd had experience with defibrillators. It's not like the LVADs where they're all patients with experience with LVADs. But they all have experience with the hospital, but they have some other advantages. And then additionally, we're kind of getting that longitudinal relationship. So I don't think this panel of how do we incorporate patient-centered principles, at least from the patient engagement aspect of patient-centered principles in PCORI, I don't know if we have it figured out just right yet. It's certainly a work in progress, and I'm not sure what the best way to do this in a meaningful way is, but that's sort of our current thinking, is a panel with some experience, some training, and a longitudinal relationship. So maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, in fact, actually, I would kind of agree. Now, we haven't even started our grant yet, but when we wrote the grant, one of the comments was that we hadn't engaged a stakeholder meeting yet. And I was like, well, we didn't have the grant yet. How are we supposed to do that? I mean, we stopped growing money off trees a while ago, so I wasn't sure exactly how we were supposed to have paid for all of that. Not that it was a huge amount. We did have, however, we developed a survey, which we did. We interact with the Rocky Mountain MS Center, which is an advocacy society in town. And they were able to put this one-page survey online, and we were able to get like 96 responses in about a week and able to tabulate it. And that actually qualified as our patient engagement prior to writing the grant. And so there is this sort of catch-22 that you're supposed to have engaged them before you even get the grant. They're like, well, that's a little more challenging. For us, we, with regard to patient engagement, we have a variety of reasons to engage patients on a routine basis anyway, because we do a variety of educational seminars and other things over time that we get in relatively small rooms with patients, and we've had patient engagement things for other purposes as well. So, so I haven't noticed this concept of authentic patients versus advocates that you've described. I'm not sure exactly what that means. For us, all of our patients are pretty authentic. Some are just noisier than other people, I think, which is fine. We like the noisy ones, but it's, I suppose, true that there might be a lot of people that might have to try and draw out and engage a little bit more. Just because they're quiet doesn't mean they have a lack of interesting ideas. So we're still not sure. So we're set up we're going to be 12 sites across the United States. We're going to do what we call stakeholder advisory committees here and in Cleveland, and we're going to do those routinely throughout, mostly at the front end and the back end, because in theory, another big difference with regard to these grants compared to other grants is the need to rapidly disseminate your findings. And it was a big deal when we were having these discussions about extending our study. They didn't want to extend it too long because they were concerned we wouldn't have data that we could disseminate. And this is something that is not trivial. It will butt up against traditional academic standards where you withhold data until you sort of report it more publicly at meetings and report it more publicly in publications. They want, you got the data, they want it out there. They want it out there yesterday. And I'm not sure how that's going to work. We certainly haven't gotten that far. It's now a 4.5-year study, and I got 4.5 years to figure that out, I guess. But there'll be some tensions like that are different than the way we usually do business, and we're going to have to see how that works out. So I'm not sure how that's going to work out yet. Sure, go ahead.
I apologize if you said this. I wanted to say thank you for being explicit a little bit with some of the criteria you use in terms of do they understand a shared agenda. Because it's important for me. I realized there was like a light bulb that came on when I realized we're talking about a methodological construct as opposed to something needing patient accommodation. So it's helpful to know that. I'm wondering, how did you vet your original sample of 20 people as authentic patients? How did they come to you for you to do those? How were they selected?
So we sort of snowballed through our clinical relationships and some of the other providers in clinic, and we asked, I forget exactly how we worded it, but have you had some patients who've had some major medical experiences, are also over the age of 65 and maybe have multiple chronic illnesses that might be a good participant in a panel? And then so some of the docs at our clinic sent us a few names, and those are the people we reached out to. So it was really just a convenience snowballing. We were just exploring this idea of having a longitudinal panel of people who had experience with the healthcare system. Is it somebody saying something? Oh yeah.
No, but I wonder what you're saying. Would you be willing to share your interview guide?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, I can easily do that. Sure, go ahead.
I have a very detailed question and a bigger question. So the detailed one is, how much are you compensated? Just as we think about budgeting and fair compensation relative to not just the patient maybe, but also the different stakeholders that you have. And then I have another part that's more of a how does the question, which is in light of the authentic and the advocate, how you're thinking about linking of this engagement with the dissemination goals, right? Because being at the PCORI meeting, dissemination is important, and the spread of the dissemination is important. And I heard a bit of the pull in more of these advocate patients because that helps with that goal of spread. So I was curious how you're kind of weighing those two, if you think of them as two different kinds of panel groups you're working with for different purposes, or if it's blended. Just your thoughts.
What was your
The first one is very much how are you budgeting?
Oh, yeah. Right.
Especially if we can think about patient, and I'm curious, you may have more experience there, but the other stakeholders, how are you budget? If you have a legislator, if you have a pharma member, just curious how you.
It sounds like you have more stakeholders at more levels. Focusing just on the patient. For the ICD project, Kaiser required us to go through research, so we gave them like a $25 gift card per meeting, and that was it. For the LVAD project, we just at the university didn't consider it research. There's another tension with this. You're recruiting patients. Some institutions want that to be IRB approved, some don't necessarily. With the LVAD one, we're paying them $30 an hour, I believe. Don't actually quote me on that. And we pay like parking, but they just come to meetings here basically, and we keep track of their hours and send them a check. And for our other patient advisory panel, that's all the longitudinal one. That's all volunteer, and it was set up initially as a volunteer program.
And we're paying $25 an hour for the stakeholders, and all of the, like the legislator and the pharma people, they're just not going to take the money. But all the patients and caregivers will. And then we have patient dollars for participation in the study. And I think that that's at, I think it's at like $200 for the entire study, because our study, there's not that much that they actually do that's beyond their standard of care. They have to do some patient-reported outcomes. They have to do one extra MRI scan that is not standard of care. So their actual time in the study, separate from the actual just routine clinic visits, will actually not be that much. It'll probably be, I don't know, I'm guessing now, maybe 4 hours, something like that. So roughly $25 an hour for them as well.
So then the other question is thinking about the other part of the application to go to your dissemination plan.
Right.
How you thought about these issues of the authentic versus the advocate. What's enough?
Yeah, and I would also say, relevant to that, when I last spoke with them, PCORI is really just getting to the end of some studies where they're going to be disseminating stuff, and they're still figuring it out. And they were pretty clear about them not really having a clue yet as to how they're going to require stuff. So they actually pretty explicitly stated they expect that there's going to be a lot of different ways they might want to do it, and that more funding will likely be available to aid and guide in that, because nobody really had a clue as to how they were going to do it, at least who's written grants so far, was their take on it. So I think it's pretty open as to what's going to happen. But we spent a lot of time just thinking about all the different avenues. So again, we work with the Rocky Mountain MS Center, we work with the National MS Society. We'll probably develop a Facebook page. We'll have webinars. We'll do a variety of things that are not necessarily typically done for dissemination. We'll still go to meetings though. We'll still publish papers. So some will be more traditional, but those will probably be relatively delayed in comparison to the things that will be more broadly disseminated.
So the importance of patients as stakeholders to PCORI is, I think, pretty clear, but it's less clear to me how important non-patient stakeholders are to them. Do you have a sense for that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So when I wrote the pilot grant, I made this argument that the missing stakeholder in shared decision-making is not the patients, it's the docs. I think one of the reasons so much of the shared decision-making world did so well in the early PCORI grants is because that community has been engaging patients in their research for 20 years. And so it wasn't a stretch. Many places already had established patient panels and things. It's very clear PCORI, by stakeholder, they generally mean patient. They'll give lip service to a lot of these other things, and I think maybe they're even coming around to that more. But when at the pilot meeting, they even would flip their language and say a patient advisors when they meant stakeholder. Like, so in their minds, it's patients. So yeah, I think that's also a work in progress. But I think as you think about dissemination, I think it's the other stakeholders that are going to be more helpful. Like for our LVAD work, it's the American College of Cardiology, the Joint Commission, the other people we have involved.
That's what I was asking. I mean, exactly what you're saying. Is at the meeting, you got a sense that they're broadening to other stakeholders, and if you're not addressing that to some larger degree than just the authentic, that might be at a disadvantage as new grants are because it's a changing environment.
Right.
For us, with drugs that average $65,000 a year that you might use for 30 years, there are a lot of stakeholders who are very interested in the outcome of this. This will be the first ever of any discontinuation trial, much less a randomized discontinuation trial in our world, that potentially has multi-billion-dollar impacts for medical insurers, for pharmaceutical companies, and for others. So we thought that it was extremely important to include everybody's point of view, if for no other reason than to have some cachet when you went out later and said, hey, we engaged everybody, we gave them an opportunity to talk about this and help design things and whatever, and this is what happened. At the same time, we explicitly do not have any extra funding from medical insurers, from pharmaceutical companies, or from anybody else. We may actually seek some additional funding from the National Mesh Society, but view them as impartial in this world, although that may or may not be true. And so I got the impression that that they were interested in a broad array of stakeholders, but for us, I think it's absolutely essential. For other questions, it may be much less essential. The other big obvious one for us is caregivers. A lot of our patients have a lot of caregiver interaction to help them take the medicines that they're using, even as simple as handing them a pill so they make sure they take the right pill, but sometimes taking care of their kids, actually giving them injections, driving them to infusions. So caregivers have a huge role, and we definitely wanted to include them regardless of what Corey wanted, but I think they do want them. So I agree that they're probably still trying to figure it out, but the impression I've gotten is that, at least from the sort of pink sheets that we got back, that they were happy with our engagement plan because it included a broad array of people. And we got actually letters of support from pharma, from the state legislator, from medical insurers prior. They went into the initial submission. And so I think as much of that as you can get ahead of time, they're impressed by that. And I can tell you, the ones that were unsuccessful in our department were notably lacking in things like that. The more you have of that stuff up front, the better off you're going to be in terms of likelihood of success. Go ahead.
Based on what you were saying, and I've noticed this too, just working with them, they do seem so much more flexible as opposed to saying NIH or person.
Right.
I wonder if they would let you use like a surplus of funds to kind of create a patient advisory panel for the next spring.
They actually have separate funding for that.
Oh, there's separate funding.
Yes, they do. So, and I would encourage you to consider writing for that.
I got a question from the online audience. This is from a colleague at UNM. He's asking, should patient engagement be an aim in the PCORI proposals, or should it be more of a method or process evaluation measure?
I'll let you take that one.
I'm not sure it should be either. If I misunderstand, so I'm sorry, but it's definitely not an aim, because it should be kind of pre-aims. It should be just,
right.
I mean, ideally they want them to be on your study team, and so if it was an aim, it would kind of imply they weren't on your study team. And then as a method or process, there's definitely a method or process around engaging them, but I'm not sure that's necessarily an outcome measure or a measure. I wasn't sure how it was worded. I think the ideal situation is you have some patients who sat down with you and you developed this idea together and you wrote most of it and got their feedback. Now that's, after trying to do that, it's almost completely unrealistic what I just said. But I think that's sort of the ideal in their minds on the patient engagement piece.
But to the last question, they do have funding available where the outcome is to have their patient engagement. And you could, in theory, you could see a way that you might have a chronic patient advisory committee or stakeholder advisory committee where you're meeting with them on a routine basis and asking what question's important to you. I mean, this was a question that they put out as an RFP, but it was not specifically to do a randomized discontinuation trial. It was to do, I don't even remember what the actual RFP said for this one, but it was more broad, and they could help you define something that's a question that is relevant to them. So we used our survey to simply ask people, is this a relevant question? But it was still a question that we came up with. I could definitely foresee having an ongoing group of people that you interact with where you can help define what they want to find out.
Yeah, just to add on to that, one of our other colleagues at Ford's got one of these pilot planning collaboration agreements, and what he's doing is creating parent advisory committees within a pediatric practice-based research network. So the idea there is that parents within this group would, on an ongoing basis, provide input about ideas they thought were important to study about their children in these practice settings. So that's exactly what we're doing.
And I think, and it's interesting, I think a qualitative study could be an aim in a PCORI grant. But I think some people sort of conflate qualitative research with patient engagement in research. I think in one there are partners doing the study with you, and in the other you're sort of studying them and studying their perspectives. I think there's a fine line. I think that's where a lot of the interinstitutional variability in how they see stakeholder engagement comes from. Is, are you asking them to give you feedback on the research, or are you asking them to talk about their experience? One of which is research, one of which is closer to research, one of which isn't.
I remember having a conversation with the IRB about that, and I think that as long as, I think they would be speaking on behalf of the court then, like you said, but I think you can do both as long as you just make them aware of that. You're consenting that. And I think they do allow them to be part of the study team and something you're studying.
Yeah, so we had an ARCACID form, we had a box. We did the qualitative interview. Would you be willing to be invited back for a patient panel? And had them say yes or no.
That raises another question, though. If you do these, advisory committees, do you need consent for that? I mean, do you need IRB approval for that? I don't think you do, because it's a quality improvement issue and it's a design issue. You're not asking any pertinent medical information from them. You're asking them questions about a disease process. So I don't think that you do,
Unless
but
you want to study it as well, and then you do.
right.
And then you do it.
Well,
I think the Corey's okay.
but that's where University of Colorado you don't. Kaiser, Colorado you do. John Hopkins you do. So at least as of a couple of years ago. So I think we've got a good IRB that sort of understands this community engaged research, probably because of the years of work that's been going on here. They're a little more informed. But some of the other IRBs that I've heard from, especially at the pilot meeting, this was a discussion. They don't see it that way. They see every patient engagement panel as something that has to be IRB approved, which is a barrier.
Oh, absolutely. Because you have to do amendment after amendment after amendment after amendment if you have patients modifying the project.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. At our advisory meeting, Kaiser's IRB required us to read this. This is confidential. This is voluntary. All of that. And it didn't play right.
So advice for someone that's wanting to submit a methods proposal. Right. On ways to engage for a methods meeting. I'll just say dissemination. So it's not disease specific, but it's, it could be flooding, researchers doing that. Have you picked up anything as you've met with other researchers? Have they, Michael Kahn here has a method. Anything that you would have as advice?
For engaging patients in particular in dissemination?
In a methods proposal. So it's not comparing the effectiveness of something, but it's a PCOR comparative effectiveness methods proposal.
So you got to be comparing something then. You can look at a comparison of different techniques of patient engagement in, disease X,
Right.
which would be fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're still gonna. I think that they'd be interested in that because they definitely have. I mean, I haven't looked at those in more detail because that is not an area that particularly interests me. But I think that they absolutely are interested in that because that's what they want to do. They want to find better ways to disseminate or to get patient involvement at whatever level. So, I think, looking at it, I think you will do better if you frame it around a disease process because it might be unique to that. Cancer might be totally different than, hemophilia. I mean, it could be a completely different technique that would be necessary to do whatever you're talking about.
I mean, and it seems like there's something with this sort of varying patient phenotypes and what roles can each group play in dissemination? An advocate versus the quiet, authentic person with the deep experiences. Maybe they could have a role of helping develop narratives and messages, whereas the advocate could have a role of traveling to DC and talking to legislatures. I think maybe trying to figure out which patients can have which roles that best fit their needs. Because the advocates lose that authenticity that some other people could provide.
So I must be missing some. Is there like some formal language you're using about authentic patients versus advocates?
I don't know if it's PCORI. We found a few articles on it that kind of talked about the spectrum between how people move away from being sort of the authentic patient to trying to push an agenda. And so we've been using that. I think it's tough if somebody comes into one of these groups and wants to do one thing and wants that. Like if you were doing a shared decision making on mammography and you got the head of the Pink Ribbon Society on your stakeholder panel, you're going to have a really tough discussion every time you sit down. And maybe that would be a good thing over time, but it could also be pretty derailing.
Yeah, but I think the concept is you probably invite a lot of different people with different backgrounds.
I think that's right.
And so, I mean, so there may be some formal heuristic decision-making tree that's different. I mean, this is way out of my realm, but my view is that they all have different things to offer, and they'll just offer it different ways at different times, and their experience will change as they age with their condition. I mean, taking care of a chronic condition, for example, they may be totally different 20 years apart from each other.
There's a difference when there's people on the panel that are representing an organization, right? So, the example you gave of somebody who's, an official in an advocacy organization, particularly if these people are making a living, right?
Yeah.
That to me, that's a very different thing than being a patient.
I mean, I think if you were doing a qualitative study to understand the range of perspectives, you want everybody. I think at least for these advisory groups, you want people who are really good at playing in the sandbox. Otherwise, it just breaks down because it's already really hard. At least that's what I've sort of come to, and that's with this new panel. We have a really nice sandbox with them. But yeah, we're missing perspectives. We're missing the quiet people. We're missing the advocates. But they're really good for somebody who has an idea and wants to get feedback for 30 or 45 minutes. Or if you meet with them every month to kind of present the ideas and get feedback, they're good like that. But you're right. It's not the full range of perspectives. You do lose that. And so I think that's part of the trade-off, actually. Right.
I mean, for a chronic disease, I take care of a chronic disease. You could look at people who were newly diagnosed compared to people that were 60 and had the condition for 30 years, and you would get very variable responses. When people have done sort of risk analyses, how do people view risk as they age with the condition? You get very different responses. Men are different from women. People with a recent relapse of their MS are different from people who haven't had a relapse in a while. People who are older versus younger have a different view of the world, and how they accept risk and how they deal with risk is completely different. So you would foresee that people would even change their own minds as they age with the condition. So
did you stratify, when you were proposing your patient groups, did you propose all kinds of stratifications?
No, because they're not that big. I mean, to really stratify it, to make it like statistically stratified, I mean, you'd have to have 500 people there, but but yes. So yes, well, I think in the broad sense, I mean, we said, okay, well, who do we want there? We said, yeah, we want old, we want young, we want those who need caregivers, that don't need caregivers. We want definitely men and women. We want black and white. We want everybody. And so we just intentionally thought, okay, who's out there, and who would we need to get represented? And we just tried to go as broad as possible. Anybody else? I mean, I would just maybe summarize and say that, it's been a learning experience for me to go through this. It's been very different. It's not like any other grant I've written. for when you write grants, a lot of times the most important thing is to ask the right question. And then everything else to sort of flow from that. And for us, this was easy because no one had ever asked this question. And so I think when push comes to shove, it's a different process, but they still ultimately want to make sure you have an interesting question and an important question. And in this case, something that is particularly relevant to patients' question. And if you do that, then you'll have success. And if you don't do that, and the ones that have not been successful in our department, I think, did not do that. I think that's the main reason why, is they just never sort of got the process right, and they never sort of asked the question the way it was interesting to PCORI.
Bring up another point about patient-centered and patient-centered outcomes. This is really a struggle when you write one of these grants, because on the one hand, you want patients or your community to tell you what kind of outcomes they care about. On the other hand, you have to plan your grant around outcomes. And that's always a tough thing. So how did you deal with that issue?
Well, for us, we have a whole host of patient-reported outcomes that have been studied over the course of the last 15 years or so. So we have already a number of validated outcome measures that we're able to go to, and then we have something that's generically been in place from the NIH, which is a validated tool called NeuroQual, so neurologic quality of life, that is generic across multiple different disease conditions. And then we have a bunch of disease-specific ones, the multiple sclerosis impact scale, the multiple sclerosis modified fatigue scale, and others. So we went for a very deliberately a broad range of different scales that had clearly been vetted, had clearly been validated, had been used in a variety of different studies. It was interesting, at the same time that I was writing the grant, I had been asked to sit with a neuro-oncology group to talk about their outcome measures, because in many respects, they're like lab rat animals studies. They have, their major outcomes are dead or alive, legs up or legs down. And they have been struggling with how to come up with other outcome measures that are meaningful to patients. So I spent, I don't know, probably 30 hours with these people just talking about the different kinds of outcome measures that they were doing. And we had a whole panel meeting, just got our paper accepted last week, discussing all the different ways, the different types of patient-centered outcome measures that are available, everything from performance measures to everything else. And it was interesting to sort of go through the process with them, because they're neurologists, they're all trained the same way I am, but their thought process was completely different. So same concept though. So for us, we went for broad range, trying to incorporate a variety of different things, and we may still add some other stuff based on our stakeholder advisory committee meetings. I think we have stuff that's covered this pretty good, but we may find out that there's something else we have to do. And for example, right now we have no caregiver outcome measures at all. And so one of the things we want to design in these stakeholder advisory committee meetings is exactly that.
It's a little easier, I think, in the shared decision-making world to meet some of those PCORI definitions of patient-centered in terms of matching, are the treatments what the patients were looking for. So we use outcomes of decision quality, which is an informed, value-concordant decision. And if the IOM's definition of patient-centered care, providing care that's concordant with patients' values, goals, and preferences, we're pretty much directly measuring that. So it's kind of an easy case to make in the shared decision-making world, that you're measuring a patient-centered outcome. It's harder when you start getting into like quality of life and mortality and some of the harder outcomes that people like to see. So we measure quality of life in the LVAD project, but it is a secondary outcome.
Yeah, to get at that. So actually one of the things we're going to struggle with, but we have to get at, is that we're going to have our outcomes that we're going to measure, which for us will be new relapses, scan changes, changes on examination, a variety of patient-reported outcomes. But what we're going to struggle with and what we're going to have to get at is that aspect, the shared decision-making. We may have patients hit a variety of outcomes that are negative by our criteria, but which the patients may view as totally acceptable. So for example, if someone has one little new dot on their brain scan, they will have achieved the endpoint for the study. They're going to stay in the study if they want, but they will be counted as hitting an endpoint. But they may find that that's totally acceptable to them when they compare that as a trade-off with regard to side effects, costs, hassle factor, et cetera. And so we're going to have to try and figure out how to get at how those decisions are made. Because we can count stuff easily. Counting's always easy. It's the figuring out what you do with the counting that's the hard part.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks for having us.